Since the return of democracy in 1999, no major opposition presidential candidate in Nigerian electoral history has voluntarily walked away from a registered party of over 1.5 million members, a party he personally transformed into a national force, to join one that at this moment controls 0 governorships, 0 Senate seats, and 0 seats in the House of Representatives. Peter Obi just did exactly that. And while every commentator in this country is debating whether the move was smart or desperate, I want to put a different question on the table. One that nobody in mainstream Nigerian media has been willing to ask directly. Who benefits from Peter Obi being inside a structurally weak party heading into 2027? And is the person who benefits actually Peter Obi himself? Because I have been tracing the financial architecture behind ADC's sudden relevance, the office openings, the media contracts, the state-level organizational hires, and what I found does not match the story you've been giving. Stay with me. This gets deeper. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political analysis mainstream media is too afraid or too compromised to deliver. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. Let us start with what actually happened, not the version being circulated on panel shows, but the sequence of events as they unfolded institutionally. Peter Obi did not simply leave the Labour Party because he was frustrated. He left because the Labour Party's internal machinery had been turned into a weapon, and that weapon was pointed at him. To understand why, you need to understand what internal party machinery actually means in Nigerian electoral law. Under the Electoral Act 2022, it is the party's recognized National Working Committee that controls the conduct of primaries. The NWC determines the process, the timeline, and the validity of a candidate's nomination. If you do not control that committee, or if the committee's recognition is legally contested, then you do not control your own path to the ballot. That is exactly the situation Obi was in. The Labour Party's leadership had fractured into competing factions, Julius Abure's camp controlling the administrative organs, and Obi's allies contesting that control in the Federal High Court. Multiple suits, multiple orders, multiple appeals, a legal labyrinth with no clean exit. And the longer that labyrinth existed, the more useful it became to certain outside parties. Because ambiguity in party leadership during the approach to an election cycle is not just a legal problem, it's a political tool. Obi chose exit. He announced his defection to the African Democratic Congress ADC, and the political commentariat immediately reached for the most obvious interpretation: desperation, a fading figure grasping at any available vehicle. That interpretation is wrong. And I'm going to show you exactly why. Here is the fact that reframes everything being said about this move. The question you've been hearing is, can ADC compete with APC and PDP? That's the wrong question. It's designed to make you evaluate ADC against the two dominant parties and conclude it falls short. The right question, the one that explains Obi's decision, is this: can ADC deliver a clean primary, maintain control of its own administrative organs, and prevent institutional sabotage of his candidacy between now and 2027? On all 3 counts, the answer today is yes. And for a candidate who was watching his own party machinery being used against him, a clean vehicle is not a consolation prize. It's the entire strategic objective. Now, consider the historical parallel Obi has already lived. In 2022, he made a structurally similar move, departing PDP for Labour, a party that most Nigerian voters had never engaged with at the presidential level. 18 months later, he won Lagos, he won the FTC, he pulled over 6 million votes nationally. Not because Labour had infrastructure, because he built infrastructure through Labour while controlling the platform. He is attempting to replicate that process. The question is whether the conditions in 2027 allow for it. And that question takes us directly into the institutions that will determine the answer. Let us talk about the institutions. not in the abstract, but specifically, naming the mechanisms and the legal frameworks that govern what Peter Obi can and cannot do from an ADC platform. The first institution is INEC. The Independent Electoral Commission's role in this story is foundational, and it operates at a level of technical detail that most political analysis skips over. INEC does not just count ballots. INEC recognizes party leadership. INEC validates primaries. And critically, it is INEC's recognition of a party's National Working Committee that determines whose name appears on the presidential ballot under which party's platform. This is not a technicality. This is the entire game. In a scenario where two factions of the Labour Party were both claiming INEC recognition, each with its own court orders, its own court appeals, its own legal arguments, the practical outcome was that the entity legally empowered to validate or invalidate Obi's primary process was contested. The faction you did not control could, in theory, run a parallel primary, produce a parallel candidate, and create a dispute that INEC would then have to adjudicate. That adjudication process takes time. And in electoral politics, time is the one resource you cannot buy back. Under ADC, that problem disappears. He enters a structure with no internal factional war, no competing NWC, no pre-existing legal siege. The second institution is the Federal High Court, and this is where the pattern of institutional weaponization becomes most visible. This is not a new technique in Nigerian politics. In 2019, the APC's internal crisis over Rivers State governorship primaries was deliberately kept alive through litigation until the electoral window was compromised. In Imo State in 2020, the Supreme Court installed a governor after a completed election result, establishing as a living legal precedent that judicial intervention in electoral outcomes does not end at the ballot, it can extend after the fact. The weaponization of internal party disputes through controlled litigation is documented Nigerian political history. But what makes Obi's case notable is the sophistication with which it was applied, not to defeat him directly, but to occupy and exhaust his organizational bandwidth during the exact window when a campaign should be building momentum. The third institution is the Electoral Act 2022 itself, specifically Section 82, which governs internal party democracy and the timelines for congresses and conventions. The disputes over whether Labour followed these timelines are the exact legal terrain on which the institutional battle was fought. The ambiguity in that section around what constitutes valid compliance and who gets to make that determination in a disputed leadership situation creates a gray zone that a well-resourced adversary can exploit indefinitely. And here's the deeper structural truth. You don't have to win in court to win strategically. You only need to delay. Delay a candidate's primary process by 3 months and you compress his campaign timeline, disrupt his fundraising schedule, fracture his volunteer networks, and force him to spend money on lawyers instead of on mobilization. Even if every court eventually rules in his favor, the damage is already done. The paper checks on all of this exist. The Electoral Act mandates internal democracy. The Constitution guarantees rights of association. INEC has procedural rules. But the gap between what exists on paper and what happens in practice in Nigeria's institutional environment under political pressure in the approach to a high-stakes election is the operative reality. Now, there is a financial dimension to ADC's recent development that I flagged at the start of this analysis, and I want to return to it here because it's connected to the institutional question in a way that most coverage is missing. ADC's National Secretariat has undergone documented infrastructure expansion since late 2023. New state offices, new media engagement, upgraded registration drives across multiple geopolitical zones. These expenditures predate Peter Obi's formal defection announcement. Someone was investing in ADC before Obi's move was public knowledge. There is one financial actor connected to that investment whose name does not appear in any official ADC filing. A businessman with documented relationships in both the ruling party's orbit and the opposition space simultaneously. That pattern in Nigerian political financing does not signal ideological commitment, it signals hedging. It signals that someone is buying access to multiple possible outcomes. I'm going to come back to exactly what that means and what it tells us about who is actually funding the next phase of Obi's political career, because it changes the calculus of this entire story.
Let us now build the strategic map. Who benefits, who loses, what the 2027 arithmetic looks like, and where the money actually flows. Start with Peter Obi himself, because the benefit to him is specific and structural, not merely symbolic. He gains clean ownership of ADC's party machinery at the leadership level. He escapes a factional war that was consuming the Obidient movement's organizational energy and financial bandwidth. And he enters 2027 as the candidate who controls his platform, rather than a candidate who is at the mercy of a party executive whose interests may diverge from his own. That last point is critical. In 2023, one of the persistent vulnerabilities of the Obi campaign was that Labour's existing state-level structures varied wildly in competence, loyalty, and organizational capacity. Some state chapters were effectively controlled by legacy politicians who had little investment in Obi's success. Under ADC, Obi's team has the opportunity to rebuild those state structures from the ground up, installing people who are operationally aligned with the campaign rather than inherited fixtures with their own agendas. Now, consider ADC's existing structure. What does the party gain? It gains national visibility overnight. It gains a candidate who has already demonstrated the ability to mobilize 6 million votes from a standing start. And it gains access to the Obidient financial network, which at its peak in 2022 and 2023 was raising funds at a rate no Nigerian opposition structure had matched in the post-2015 era. Diaspora contributions, youth donor networks, civil society-linked funding streams. That network did not dissolve when Labour collapsed. It went dormant. ADC is now the activation signal. Now, look at who loses, and here is where the threat map for Tinubu's administration comes into sharp focus. Julius Abure and the Labour Party establishment lose their leverage entirely. Their only source of national relevance was the Obi candidacy. Without it, Labour reverts to a regional party with limited footprint. The internal war they prosecuted against Obi turned out to be a war they won at the cost of losing everything they were fighting over. PDP's opposition consolidation strategy is now in crisis. The PDP's calculation heading into 2027 had been patient and deliberate. Wait for Labour to implode, watch Obi lose his organizational base, and position PDP as the only viable anti-Tinubu vehicle and consolidate the opposition electorate by default. That calculation assumed Obi would either return to PDP or become politically marginal. Neither is happening. And Obi, on a fresh platform with operational control of his machinery, forces PDP into an active strategic decision it was hoping to avoid: merge with ADC and subordinate itself to Obi's candidacy, or compete against him for the same anti-Tinubu vote and split the opposition for the second consecutive election cycle. Neither is comfortable for PDP's old guard. And then there is the APC's 2027 Southeast strategy, which is where the Tinubu camp's anxiety is most acute. Since 2023, the Tinubu administration has been executing a deliberate play for Igbo economic and political loyalty, selective federal patronage, targeted infrastructure announcements in Southeast states, quiet conversations with Igbo business leaders. The strategic logic was straightforward. If you can peel even 20% of the Igbo vote from Obi in 2027, you fragment his base and reduce the electoral mathematics he needs to be competitive. You don't need to win the Southeast, you just need to make it closer. That strategy depends entirely on Obi being weakened going into the election, on the Obidient movement being organizationally exhausted, financially depleted, and politically demoralized by internal Labour Party warfare. An Obi who exits Labour clean, takes operational control of ADC, and re-energizes his base with a fresh platform disrupts that strategy at its foundation. Let me be precise about 2027 electoral mathematics, because this is where the phrase "Terrifies Tinubu" moves from rhetorical to literal. In 2023, Tinubu won the presidency with approximately 37% of the total vote, a plurality in a three-way race. He crossed the constitutional threshold of 25% in two-thirds of states, but only barely in several. The distribution of that vote was heavily skewed towards the northwest and the southwest. Outside those zones, his margins were narrow. The scenario that Tinubu's political strategists are modeling is not Obi winning outright. It's Obi consolidating the southeast, competing effectively in the southwest urban centers, particularly Lagos, and anchoring a northern alliance through a carefully selected running mate that breaks through in Kano, Kaduna, and Plateau. Under that scenario, the 2027 race is not a three-way split. It becomes a two-way contest between Tinubu and a consolidated opposition candidate. And in a two-way contest, Tinubu's 37% plurality becomes an exposure, not a strength. That's the mathematical terror, and it is why the response from the APC will not be dismissal, it will be active, targeted disruption. Now, let us follow the money, because the financial layer is where strategic intent becomes most legible. The Obidient movement's fundraising architecture in 2022 and 2023 was genuinely novel in Nigerian political history. It was decentralized, digitally organized, diaspora-anchored, and largely resistant to the patronage-based financial controls that dominant parties use to manage opposition campaigns. That decentralization was also its weakness. It was harder to coordinate, slower to deploy at scale, and vulnerable to organizational fragmentation when the central candidate was embattled. What ADC offers is the possibility of combining that grassroots financial network with a more centralized organizational structure, one that Obi's team controls from the top down. And the unnamed financial actor I flagged, the one whose investment in ADC's infrastructure predates the public announcement, is significant precisely because he represents the entry of larger, more structured capital into that equation.
His investment in ADC is not a bet on Obi winning. It is a bet on Obi being competitive, on ADC being a relevant platform in 2027 regardless of the final outcome. In Nigerian political finance, that distinction matters enormously. You fund a winner to capture a government. You fund a competitive candidate to purchase access and leverage in whatever post-election power arrangement emerges. The presence of that kind of capital in ADC is not a sign of confidence in the outcome. It is a sign of confidence in the process. And that, paradoxically, is a stronger signal of institutional credibility than an outright endorsement would be. There are three names circulating in northern political circles as potential ADC running mate candidates. I will not name them here because none has been confirmed, and naming unconfirmed running mate candidates does a disservice to the analysis. But I will tell you what to watch for. A running mate from Kano or Kaduna signals that Obi is going for the electoral knockout, targeting the exact northern urban youth bloc that produced his strongest northern numbers in 2023. A running mate from the middle belt signals a defensive posture, consolidating a base rather than expanding it. A running mate from any southern zone signals that the northern negotiation has failed and the campaign is adjusting strategy in real time. Watch that announcement above all other signals between now and the end of 2025. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. Zoom out now, because this story is not ultimately about Peter Obi's career prospects. It is about what a competitive or non-competitive 2027 election means for Nigeria's institutional architecture, its economic trajectory, and its national cohesion. Start with the federal balance of power. If Obi enters 2027 with a credible platform and performs strongly, the immediate structural consequence extends beyond the presidency. An energized ADC mobilization in competitive states affects National Assembly seat composition. It affects gubernatorial races. It affects state assembly dynamics. A president who wins in 2027 against genuine opposition with a legislature shaped by real electoral competition faces a different political environment than one who enters office against a fragmented, exhausted opposition. The former must negotiate, the latter can mandate. That distinction shapes the entire governance trajectory of the next 4 years, including the revenue allocation debates, the NNPCC restructuring, and the derivation formula adjustments that directly affect how resources flow between the federal center and the states. Those are not abstract policy questions. They are the architecture of who gets what in Nigeria's political economy.
Now, the economic dimension. Competition has a direct policy effect that is often underestimated. In 2023, the Tinubu administration's early reform moves, fuel subsidy removal, Naira unification, were implemented without meaningful opposition coordination. The speed and structure of those reforms and the distribution of their costs across income groups were shaped in part by the absence of organized political accountability. Reforms that might otherwise be phased or cushioned were implemented in ways that compressed the pain onto the most vulnerable segments of the population. A credible 2027 challenger creates political costs for regressive shock reforms. Whether you support or oppose any specific policy, the presence of electoral accountability changes the calculus of implementation. The administration must consider what an mobilized opposition can do with the political consequences of economic suffering. That constraint is not paralyzing, but it is real and it matters for ordinary Nigerians. The security dimension is perhaps the least discussed implication of this story, but it is important. When formal political channels are seen as non-functional, when citizens and political actors alike perceive the electoral system as captured and predetermined, informal channels of political power gain relevance. Armed groups, ethnic militias, and resource capture networks all expand their influence in environments where democratic competition is perceived as theater. A credible opposition candidacy on a clean platform is not by itself a security policy, but it is a stabilizing signal in the political marketplace. It tells potential spoilers, armed and unarmed, that formal competition remains a viable pathway. And then there is the deepest implication: national legitimacy. The 2023 election produced a result that a significant and demographically broad segment of the Nigerian electorate did not accept as legitimate. This was not purely an Igbo grievance or a youth grievance. It was a cross-regional, cross-ethnic expression of doubt about the fairness of the process. That wound has not closed. The political cynicism it generated has not been converted into civic disengagement. It has been converted into waiting for the next credible opportunity to express a political preference through formal channels. Now, the economic actor whose connection to ADC I flagged in the institutional analysis. Here is what his presence actually means. He is a businessman with documented relationships in both the APC's orbit and in opposition political circles. His investments span sectors that require federal regulatory goodwill regardless of who sits in Aso Rock. He is not an ideologue, he is a system actor. His investment in ADC's infrastructure before Obi's announcement is not a political endorsement, it is a structural calculation. If there is a 30% probability that ADC produces a president in 2027, the cost of building early access to that platform is worth the investment, even if the outcome is a Tinubu second term. He is buying optionality, and the fact that he made that purchase before the announcement tells you that the announcement was not a surprise to everyone, and that the infrastructure being built around ADC is more organized, more pre-planned, and more institutionally serious than the desperate defection narrative would have you believe. Consider this final data point on national stakes. In 2007, Muhammadu Buhari ran for president on the ANPP, a party with structural limitations comparable to ADC's today. He was dismissed as unserious. He ran again in 2011 on CPC, dismissed again. In 2015, he moved to APC and won. Not because he changed, but because the coalition architecture around him finally reached critical mass.
That process took 3 platforms and 12 years. Obi is not Buhari, and 2027 is not 2015. The timelines and the coalitions are different, but the pattern of a high-credibility candidate iterating through platforms until the institutional conditions align, that pattern is not unprecedented in Nigerian democracy. And the establishment was wrong about this candidate before in 2023. The cost of being wrong again in 2027 is higher for the ruling administration.
Let's bring in the international layer, because this story does not stop at Nigeria's borders, and the external stakes are shaping decisions being made inside Nigeria right now. Start with Washington and London. Western governments have a documented institutional interest in the quality of Nigerian electoral competition, not out of altruism, but out of strategic calculation. Nigeria is West Africa's largest economy, its most populous democracy, and the region's most important counter-terrorism partner. Political instability in Nigeria has direct consequences for ECOWAS, for regional migration patterns, and for Western investment exposure across the sub-region. The U.S. State Department's formal assessment of the 2023 Nigerian elections flagged irregularities. USAID-funded civil society organizations that supported election observation in 2023 are still operational and are already beginning early cycle engagement with 2027 processes. A credible opposition candidate on a clean, institutionally stable platform is useful to Western diplomatic actors, not because they prefer Obi to Tinubu, but because a genuine electoral contest reduces the pressure on those governments to issue public statements criticizing Nigeria's democratic process. They can point to the competition as evidence of institutional health, rather than having to navigate the diplomatic discomfort of publicly questioning an ally's election result. For diaspora Nigerians in the UK, US, and Canada, and there are hundreds of thousands of them, this is not an abstract geopolitical observation. The Obidient movement's digital and financial infrastructure in 2022 and 2023 was substantially built on diaspora energy. Contribution platforms, social media coordination, logistics support for ground operations. That infrastructure did not disappear when Labour imploded. It went dormant, waiting for a signal. ADC is that signal. But here's the critical nuance. The signal requires a response. Diaspora re-enrollment into an ADC framework is not automatic. It requires deliberate outreach, a convincing organizational narrative, and visible evidence that ADC is being built with the seriousness the 2023 campaign had. The speed and completeness of that diaspora re-enrollment over the next 12 months is the single most important leading indicator of ADC's 2027 capacity. If you are a diaspora Nigerian who was a part of the Obidient movement in 2023, watch how that outreach comes to you, because the quality of that communication will tell you whether the platform is being built or merely being announced.
Now, the China dimension. China's engagement with Nigeria is structured differently from Western engagement. It runs through infrastructure finance, trade frameworks, and bilateral diplomatic channels that do not depend on electoral outcomes in the same way Western aid relationships do. But Chinese diplomatic actors are attentive to political stability, and a genuinely contested 2027 election introduces uncertainty into the timeline of infrastructure projects and bilateral agreements that the current administration has been advancing. Beijing's preference in Nigerian politics is administrative continuity, not because they prefer any particular ideology, but because continuity is operationally convenient for long-term capital deployment. A competitive 2027 race is, from their perspective, a risk variable. They will not intervene in it, but their commercial representatives will be watching ADC's organizational development with careful attention, assessing the probability of a platform transition and adjusting project timeline assumptions accordingly. The African Union and ECOWAS dimension is perhaps the most underreported international stake in this story.
Nigeria's regional leadership role, already under significant strain from the Sahel coup wave and the ECOWAS response to the Niger crisis, depends on domestic legitimacy. An administration perceived regionally as having suppressed genuine democratic competition loses the moral authority to lead on democratic governance questions in the sub-region. That is not a hypothetical cost. It is the immediate diplomatic reality following the ECOWAS interventions of 2023, where Nigeria's credibility as a democracy champion was already being questioned by some African states. A competitive 2027 election, one that the AU and ECOWAS can point to as evidence of functional democratic competition, strengthens Nigeria's regional standing, regardless of who wins. And the presence of a credible opposition candidate on a clean platform is part of what makes an election legible as competitive to regional and international observers.
I want to do something that most political analysis in Nigeria refuses to do. I want to give you the strongest possible version of the opposing argument, the case that this move is a mistake, and I want to present it fully, without straw-manning it, before I explain why I think the evidence points elsewhere. Here is the Steelman case against Obi's ADC move. Party infrastructure is not simply money and organization. It is legitimacy. And legitimacy in Nigerian electoral politics is cultural and emotional before it is institutional. Labour's brand, whatever the internal chaos that eventually destroyed it, was built on a generational energy that does not transfer by decree. The Obidient movement's 2023 performance was not purely organizational, it was symbolic. Young Nigerians who had never voted before turned out for Peter Obi not just because he was competent, but because Labour represented something, a disruption of the inherited political order, a break from the two-party duopoly that had governed Nigeria since the beginning of the Fourth Republic. That symbolic charge was attached to the Labour Party as a vessel. You cannot simply transplant it into ADC by announcing a defection. Cultural meaning is not portable on command. And rebuilding the emotional resonance that Labour had, the feeling that voting for this party means something different, means a challenge to the system itself, inside a party that most young Nigerians have never heard of on a compressed 2027 timeline, is not an engineering problem that money solves. It is a deeper challenge of political meaning-making. That is the strongest version of "this is a mistake" argument, and I want you to sit with it for a moment, because it is not wrong about everything. Here is where it breaks down. It conflates two distinct things, the party brand and the candidate brand, and in the Obidient case, those two things were never the same. When Peter Obi moved from PDP to Labour in 2022, Labour had zero cultural resonance among Nigerian youth. Zero. It was not a symbol of disruption. It was a party that most voters could not name three officials of. The cultural energy, the generational excitement, the symbolic weight of the movement, all of it was built after Obi arrived because Obi arrived. The movement was named after him, not after the party. Obidient was never Labourient. If the cultural resonance had been attached to Labour as an institution, the movement would have continued to grow after Obi's internal battles with Abure began, because Labour still existed, still had its INC registration, still had its name on the ballot. Instead, the movement's energy tracked Obi's personal political trajectory, not the party's institutional health. That is the empirical evidence that the transfer of cultural meaning follows the candidate, not the platform. Now, let me address the three biggest misconceptions circulating about this story, because each of them is distorting how Nigerians are processing what this move actually means. The first misconception is that ADC is too weak to compete nationally. This confuses a current state with a permanent condition. ADC's structural weakness today is real. It is also a solvable engineering problem, given sufficient resources, organizational talent, and time. The 2027 election is 3 years away. Labour had 18 months in 2022 to build from near zero,
and it produced the third largest presidential vote in Nigerian history. Structural weakness is not destiny, it is a baseline. The second misconception is that this move represents Obi admitting defeat. This reading applies a status framework to what is fundamentally a strategic decision. Staying inside a Labour Party whose machinery was being used against him, whose internal processes could be leveraged by adversaries to compromise his candidacy before a single vote was cast, would have been a structural defeat disguised as institutional loyalty. Leaving is the aggressive move even when it looks like retreat. The distinction matters. The third, and this is the one that bothers me most, is that the Obidient movement is finished. This conflates the movement with the party it briefly inhabited. If the movement were party-based, it would have collapsed alongside Labour's internal crisis. The fact that Peter Obi retains personal loyalty signals across social media, in diaspora networks, among youth voter communities, after 18 months of Labour's public implosion, is not incidental. It is structural evidence that the movement's organizational substrate survived the party. The party was the vehicle, the movement is the engine, and the engine did not stop. Here is the piece of evidence that most people on both sides of this debate have completely missed. In every state where Obi's 2023 vote share was strongest, the underlying driver was not Labour Party state chapter structure. In most of those states, Labour state chapter was underdeveloped, under-resourced, and operationally marginal. The actual mobilization was delivered by civic society organizations, diaspora-linked networks, and youth volunteer infrastructure that operated through Labour but was never of it. Those networks have a specific and traceable institutional form. They are not informal. They have coordinators, budgets, communication channels, and organizational memory. And those networks are already in active conversation with ADC state executives in at least 4 geopolitical zones. That is the infrastructure story that nobody is reporting, and it's the reason why the ADC of December 2026 will look nothing like the ADC of today.
Let me now give you the 3 most likely next moves by the key players in this story, not as speculation, but as logical extensions of the strategic positions each actor currently occupies. The Tinubu administration will run a dual strategy. Publicly, expect marginalization through narrative, the steady drumbeat that ADC is irrelevant, that Obi is a footnote, that the 2027 election is already decided. This narrative serves a specific purpose. It is designed to suppress fundraising and volunteer mobilization in the ADC camp by making investment in the platform feel futile. Political capital follows perceived viability. If you can make ADC seem unviable, you starve it of the resources it needs to become viable. Privately, and this is the part that matters more, expect targeted pressure on ADC's regulatory standing, potential litigation around party registration compliance, attempts to recruit ADC state executives or regional officials through patronage offers, selective use of federal administrative levers to make ADC's organizational development expensive and slow. The goal here is not destruction. Destroying ADC would create a martyr narrative that energizes Obi's base. The goal is friction, making every organizational step harder, slower, and more costly than it should be. Death by 1,000 bureaucratic cuts. The PDP now faces a decision it has been deferring for 2 years and can no longer defer. Does it pursue a formal opposition coalition with ADC, merging its organizational infrastructure and state-level networks with Obi's presidential candidacy, or does it compete against him independently and split the anti-Tinubu vote for the second consecutive election? A merger is structurally attractive. It would produce a combined opposition that on paper should be able to defeat Tinubu in a head-to-head contest. But the institutional friction is enormous. The PDP's old guard, the political barons who have invested decades in controlling the party's patronage networks, would resist subordinating themselves to an Obi candidacy. The running mate negotiation alone would be a months-long battle over which regions get what in a potential post-election administration.
The more likely near-term move is back-channel coalition talks framed publicly as ideological alignment. Watch for language about opposition unity and progressive forces from PDP figures who were not using that language 6 months ago. That language will be the surface expression of a much harder negotiation happening below the surface. And then there is Peter Obi himself. The single most important strategic decision he will make between now and mid-2026 is not about messaging, not about fundraising, not about organizational expansion. It is the running mate selection.
I said this in the political strategy analysis, and I want to return to it here because the signal it sends is irreplaceable. A northern running mate from Kano or Kaduna, someone with demonstrated electoral pull in the northwest, signals that Obi is going for the structural victory, targeting the presidential mathematics directly and attempting to rebuild the cross-regional coalition that came close in 2023. A middle belt running mate signals consolidation of a more defensive coalition. Any southern running mate signals that the northern negotiation broke down. Watch that announcement. It will tell you more about ADC's 2027 prospects than any poll, any endorsement, and any organizational milestone. Now, let me give you the specific signals to monitor in the months ahead, because this analysis is only useful if it gives you tools to track how the story develops. First, INEC's response to any internal ADC leadership restructuring that Obi's team drives. Under the Electoral Act, INEC must formally recognize changes in party leadership. Watch how quickly or slowly that recognition comes. A prompt recognition is a routine administrative act. A delayed recognition is a political signal dressed as procedure. Second, business community movements in the second half of 2025. When Nigeria's major private sector figures begin making public statements about electoral preferences or conspicuously avoid doing so, the direction of those signals will tell you whether the hedge capital is moving toward ADC. The business community does not endorse candidates for ideological reasons. They endorse candidates or maintain calculated silence based on probability-weighted access calculations. If the silence begins to break toward ADC, the institutional credibility of the platform has crossed a threshold. Third, any sitting governor's public engagement with ADC. One governor's defection, particularly from a PDP state with weak loyalty to the National Party leadership, transforms ADC's organizational credibility overnight. It provides state-level administrative resources, established political networks, and a demonstrated proof of concept that ADC can hold institutional power, not merely contest for it. Now, let me give you the escalation and de-escalation scenarios because 2027 does not have a predetermined outcome. Full escalation looks like a three-way race, APC, PDP, and ADC all polling competitively, in which the presidential result triggers a dispute over threshold compliance. Nigeria's constitution requires 25% of the vote in 2/3 of states, plus a plurality. In a close three-way race, litigation over whether any candidate cleared that bar returns the outcome to the Supreme Court. Given the precedent of 2023 and the 2020 Imo State ruling, that scenario is a constitutional stress test with no clean resolution mechanism and no guarantee of institutional stability on the other side. De-escalation requires one of three conditions: a credible opposition merger that consolidates around a single candidate with broad regional support, a Tinubu administration that delivers sufficient economic relief by 2027 to diffuse the level of electoral anger currently driving opposition mobilization, or an internal ADC implosion, factional war, financial collapse, or candidate withdrawal that removes the competitive threat before the race begins. None of those three conditions is currently likely, which means the most probable scenario is a genuinely competitive, genuinely messy 2027 election, the kind Nigeria has not had in a decade. Now, let me answer the question I opened with. Who benefits from Peter Obi being inside a structurally weak party in 2027? And is it actually Obi himself?
Having traced the institutional mechanisms, the INEC recognition structures, the electoral law ambiguities, the history of litigation as a political weapon, having mapped the financial architecture, the pre-announcement infrastructure investment, the unnamed actor buying optionality in a contested electoral marketplace, having run the 2027 electoral mathematics, the conditions under which a three-way race becomes a two-way contest that changes the presidential outcome, here is the answer. It is Obi who benefits from this move, but only under two conditions. First, that the structural weakness of ADC is temporary and that the organizational investment currently being made converts the platform into a credible vehicle before the primary season begins. And second, that the unnamed financial actors investing in ADC's infrastructure are doing so to build a platform, not to manage a candidate, because those are two very different things. Building a platform means empowering a candidate to compete freely. Managing a candidate means ensuring that the platform's resources are contingent on the candidate's behavior remaining acceptable to those controlling the resources. The threat to Tinubu is real. The vulnerability for Obi is also real. The outcome depends on which of those two forces, institutional building or institutional capture, moves faster in the next 18 months. We opened with a contradiction that I want to return to now, not to resolve it neatly, but to name it honestly. A man with 6 million votes and 1.5 million registered supporters walked away from the party he built to join a structure that controls nothing. That still sounds on the surface like retreat. But what this analysis has established is that in Nigerian electoral politics, controlling a compromised something can be worth less than controlling a clean nothing. The institutions that should make political competition fair, INEC, the courts, the party registration machinery, have a documented history of being weaponized against the candidates they are supposed to serve neutrally. Obi understood that. His departure from Labour was not a concession of defeat. It was a refusal to fight on terrain that had been pre-tilted against him. The deeper question, the one that transcends Peter Obi's political career, is whether the institutional architecture of Nigerian democracy will allow a genuinely competitive 2027 election to happen at all. That question does not have a clean answer yet. The answer will emerge from the decisions made by INEC, the courts, the political parties, and ultimately Nigerian voters themselves over the next 3 years. Here is the question I want to leave you with. And I mean this genuinely, not rhetorically. Is the Obidient move to ADC a strategic masterstroke? Evidence that Obi is playing a longer, smarter game than the political establishment is giving him credit for? Or is it the beginning of a managed political exit, one in which he is kept relevant enough to split the opposition vote, but not actually empowered to win? Drop your analysis in the comments. I want to see how Nigerians are reading this. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what's really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.